Lecture 4, The City of Capitalism, Part 1. We have gone over the three paradigms that are characteristic of the relationship between architecture and urban form and the larger world of phenomena. Specifically, the first paradigm that we studied in week 1 was the city of the cosmos, characterized by big form, the operation of form as a fundamental factor in the understanding of spatial phenomena. The characteristic cities that exemplify this relationship is Beijing, the classic Chinese city, Madurai, the classic Hindu city, and Surakarta in Java, the hybrid example of between the Chinese and the Hindu systems. The second paradigm was the city as machine that we experience through the operation of systems imposed upon the landscape, sometimes imposing form on the landscape intended to operate locally according to its own logic. And thus we looked at Rome, not so much the city of Rome as the system of Roman expansion using the grid, extending that to the United States, and then looking in greater depth at the city of Chicago and how the grid, along with the architecture of the city of Chicago, the rail yards, the slaughterhouses, the infrastructure networks, how they all operated to transform this significant piece of landscape that is the Midwest of the United States into a machine for gathering and distributing commodities at a global scale. And so that's not just a system operating as a building or even a city, but an entire region and interconnected with a world system. The third example is the city as an organism. And we looked at Isfahan and other Islamic cities as an example of how complexity tends to defy understanding in either a systematic way or in a large diagrammatic big form way, but instead reveals its operation through a process, and here's the key word, the process of emergence. And so we have big forms that operate according to their diagrammatic intentions. We have large distributed systems that operate according to local logics, kind of a mechanistic approach. And then we have emergence, which is a way of understanding complexity or coming to grips and managing complexity. Now from here we move forward, and even in the examples that we've already used, we can see that each of these three characteristic operations of form are available, are in evidence in every one of these cities. And so it's really just a matter of emphasis, what is driving the process of forming and operating within the city. And so we continue on in our explorations looking for the evidence that characterizes the city as big form, the city as a system, and the city as emergence of complexity. As we move forward, one of the big challenges that we face, and when we look back at history, is that we bring to the study of past events, we bring our own personal experience and our own personal outlooks on life and our own biases. And the specific bias that seems to plague and color the way we see things in the current culture of North America in the 21st century is what I'll call the materialism bias. Stated simply, it's a bias that the important thing in all of this is money. Now, one of the larger propositions that is being tested in this course is that it is not just money, it is something else. It might be power, it might be control of who gets to tell the story, it might be the larger system of meaning that is contested. Money certainly is always there as part of that, But is money the end in and of itself, or is it means to some other end? So one way to test this hypothesis is to move forward with the presumption that, in fact, it is just the money. And so if we look at the city in that way and architecture in that way, perhaps the the cases in which it really is, the evidence supports the view that it's all about the money will become clear. But also, and more importantly, some cases when it is clearly not just about the money might emerge and allow us to understand to what extent it is just about the money and to what extent money is a means to something else. So with that larger framework in mind, we move forward into the modern period, and for the purposes of this course, we are not adopting the viewpoint of architectural history, which itself is biased by the agenda of modern architecture, which was to establish the 20th century as a unique moment in history, broken away from all prior moments in history. That modernism was on the other side of a rupture with all of the traditions that dominated in the past. Break away, a clean break, a fresh start, a tabula rasa, to remake the world from scratch, according to rational principles and functional operations of architecture and urbanism. We are not adopting that view. We are looking more at continuities. The modern period goes back to arguably the Renaissance, at least, and for our purposes, we will look at the Renaissance as a point with the rise of mercantilism. The laws of enclosure in England were part of the rise of mercantilism, of colonialism. Around 1500, we started to explore the planet with our great sailing ships and establishing relationships and global networks around the planet, which very much colored our view of the world moving forward. And so that's the larger period studied very quickly in this lecture that we call the modern period of urban form. Three topics presented in three parts. The first one is the city beautiful, the second part, industrial city, and the third part, the garden city. So we start with the city beautiful, and we start with the phenomena of the human body, which during the Renaissance became an important reawakening of an understanding of the relationship between the scale and operation of the human body in regards to architecture and urban space. And so here we have a stage set represented in Sebastiano Serlio's treatise on architecture, and it is the capturing of a classical Italian streetscape as a stage set. The street of the city is the stage upon which the drama of life unfolds for human society, is the central premise of this posture of creating a stage set after a cityscape. And the key principle here is the physics and the physiology of vision, of eyesight, that the vanishing point through the gateway, the threshold with the stair beyond, the forced perspective of the lines, the pavement on the street, the distortion of space by a falsely diminished scale of the stage set allowed the depiction of great depth, despite the fact that the stage itself was actually not so deep. But this understanding of perspective that came out during the Renaissance was a discovery, it was an invention, and it was a discovery, it was an invention, and it allowed us to do things that we otherwise would not be able to do. This was a fundamental premise in an earlier moment when Pope Sixtus V reconfigured Rome to make it a more effective instrument for supporting the pilgrimage. um, uh, getting into the empathetic voice of architecture, we talk about the Christians who uh, were offered time off for good behavior. Their time in purgatory would be shortened through the earning of indulgences. One way of earning indulgences from the church is to give money. Another way to earn indulgences from the church is to engage in a pilgrimage from wherever you lived to holy shrines where the relics of the apostles and Jesus are said to have been enshrined, and special bonus points are offered if you travel to Rome and its great destinations, the pilgrimage sites of the city of Rome. Pope Sixtus V decided to connect the different pilgrimage sites of Rome through visual corridors, again using this idea of perspective, to facilitate the pilgrimage process, to remake Rome as a more effective instrument for the implementation and the motivation and the operation of these rules of Christianity. And so here's a more realistic presentation where we see a figure ground representation of the city of Rome and the key sites of early Christianity and the visual corridors that were carved out of the ancient settlement pattern of Rome in order to facilitate these visual corridors, the connection, the interconnection of these different sites in Rome. And here you see it in a diagrammatic form of a much later rendition. This had a big impact on the architecture of Rome, as these visual principles were not just large imprints on the at the scale of the city itself, but also experiential phenomena that could be supported by the specific configuration of the architecture to perform certain experiential tasks. And so we see the Campidoglio at the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and the forecourt of St. Peter's in the Vatican, using the visual trick of a forced perspective, the same visual trick used in the Renaissance stage set of the street. This makes a perfect setting for the Pope to show up on the balcony. So there was a certain reinforcement in terms of ritual. Moving forward to London, had a great fire in 1666, corresponding almost exactly with the original Roman settlement at the crossing of the Thames at London Bridge. And you see in the inset below one plan for the reconstruction of that area according to the principles established in Pope Sixtus V's reconstruction of Rome. Here's a competing entry for that form in the reconstruction of Rome in 1666. You see the radiating streets and the important marking of important locations through the establishment of plazas, often corresponding with important churches. And then Sir Christopher Wren's grand master plan that centered around St. Paul's Cathedral, which he, the week before, had attempted to redesign the dome of, and ended up through various stages of design and redesign in reconstructing St. Paul's Cathedral later in his career. But even though he became the secretary in charge of the reconstruction of downtown London, he was not able to alter the pre-existing footprint. It turns out that the imprint of streets on the landscape have a very persistent influence on anything that follows. And the momentum of that, the sheer inertia of that imprint carried through, and today London does not look like this. It looks like it did before the fire in terms of its imprint. But this idea of the visual corridors continues to be significant to the present moment and plays a role in much of what happens in cities up to the present. Moving quickly to Paris, again in this depiction that distorts the width of the streets were not actually that large. They were much narrower. But you see, just as we looked at in the city of Florence, you can see a very early establishment of the walls, the walled city of Paris. We are looking to the southwest in this view, so flip it around in your mind so that Notre Dame Cathedral is located in a way that makes sense to you. We'll do that in moving forward. Here we see the more conventional view of Paris with north at the top. The narrow streets of Paris proved to be highly problematic for those who were attempting to govern the city. If you've seen Les Miserables, you know how the most important architecture at the moment were the barricades constructed across the narrow streets that were the instrument, the architectural instrument of revolution and revolt against the controllers of the city. The cobblestones could be picked up if you've saw the show on Broadway. The stage set of the barricades were quite remarkable, especially the way they moved in and out of position. But these narrow streets were a problem of insurrection. There was the problem of cholera and disease that at the time was believed to be caused by the lack of light and air coming into the densely populated city. When cholera struck a city, it killed tens of thousands of people. And when tens of thousands of people died due to the overcrowding, there was the other issue of revolution and violence in the streets. And so when Napoleon, the great general's nephew, became the ruler, and he fashioned himself as an emperor, Napoleon III, he had his head of public works, Baron von Haussmann, in 1849, develop a plan for the transformation of Paris, which involved the widening of streets, the cutting of straight boulevards from the different great positions, and the creation of new great positions throughout Paris, viewpoints and things to be viewed, directly emulating the physics and physiology of human vision and the planning ideas of Sixtus V in Rome. Here's a clearer diagram of the main boulevards that were executed in the first round of boulevard cuttings. Here's another version of it, which is a little more schematic, a little more detailed, but a little complex. So there's the question of how do you depict these things. This is getting closer to the standards of what we employ in this class, where the actual fabric of the city is represented still, but this gives you a sense of the scale of this project and how much of the city it actually displaced and transformed. Now we're talking about it. This is more what the doctor ordered in terms of how to depict these things. At the time, depictions at the ground level showed the churches being preserved, but the high-density housing of the poorer classes being removed entirely to make way for these grand boulevards, the results of which opened up the streets not just to light and air and movement by carriages and pedestrians, but also for armies in case of insurrection. It's very difficult to hold this sector of the city against an army when the streets are so wide that there's really no way to build a barricade across it. And it opened up these axial views. Here you see the L'Arc de Triomphe and the Champs-Élysées, the grand axis from the center of Paris out towards Versailles and the countryside. And here you start to see how transformative it was. Apartment blocks of largely uniform height and style, uh, built to frame these grand spaces of the boulevard, really in the spirit of creating outdoor rooms for the recreational benefit, not just transportation, but for increasing the quality of life with health, safety, security, light and air, vegetation, pleasant places to stroll, to see people and to be seen wearing your finest clothes. This was a bourgeois revolution. The new class of middle class arising at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the merchants class that were rising in prominence and power. It wasn't a complete dispossession and dislocation of the poor, but it was pretty thorough and pretty severe. But in the new apartment blocks shown in this sectional view, you see the piano nobile, what we would call the second floor, except for Wentworth would call the first floor. But Europeans and Wentworth call the piano nobile, call it the first floor. It's raised up off the ground level. This is the grand housing of the wealthiest Parisians, with above that the struggling young family, and above that increasing degrees of poverty until you get to the attic area where the struggling artists and poets and extreme poor laborers would occupy. The farther up you go, the greater the poverty. On the ground floor are the servants' spaces for the grand apartments on the first floor above. And these apartment blocks, their primary role was not just to make it healthy and safe for the new middle classes, but also to frame these grand spaces, the new boulevards shown in early photography here, in more of a cartoonish, political cartoon style here, and then in great impressionist paintings celebrating this new way of life of Paris. That really was the urban revolution of the modern city in all its glory, written about extensively by poets and people like Baudelaire. Made the flaneur, the classic character, leisurely walking about the city, observing things, poetically reflecting on this new crazy modern life that Paris, this transformation of Paris, so readily supported. There was a rise in consumer culture with these indoor streets cutting through the blocks, where the streets, these covered streets, would provide a very pleasant shopping environment, even in inclement weather. And there you see the photograph and the caricature of it. And the grand department store, the invention of the department store here in the Bon Marché department store, where you wouldn't go to a separate store for hosiery and the haberdashery and different articles. It was all under one roof. And it became not just an efficient way to consume, but it became a social spatial experience where you would, well, I don't have to explain it. Shopping malls do it today. You go to hang out, you go to see your friends, and it's a social context that was invented at this moment in the transformation of Paris in the mid-19th century. Here's the photograph of it. The grand staircase was the place to be seen parading. That staircase is not to facilitate shopping, it's to celebrate the social event that is going shopping. You parade down that stair and up that stair, and everyone watches you and you watch everyone else, and it's a grand social display of your clothing and who you are. It's an identity ceremony that is facilitated by the instrumentation of not just the architecture, but also the city itself. And this is one of the great examples of the continuity between the architecture and the urban form. This is Haussmann's Grand Boulevard leading to the Paris Opera House. You see the Opera House in the foreground below, Apparently, we were not the first ones to discover that it is useful to put experiential, spatial uh, access to architectural form in the foreground, the larger urban system in the background through elevated views. Apparently, that's been around. Uh, Here's another depiction of that space where the boulevard leads to the Opera House. Here's the facade of the Opera House by Charles Garnier. And the section of the Opera House, which shows, if only I could point, I would point at how huge the space behind the curtain is, off to the right. All of the fly loft above, the rehearsal spaces, the green room, the pitch of the stage itself to reinforce that diminishment of space, the perspectival effect that we saw in Serlio's engraving. And then the auditorium where the audience sits is, in a way, one of the smaller elements of this whole thing. And then off to the left are all the lobbies and balconies and grand staircases of the entry sequence and the grand hallways, where before the show, during intermission, and after the show, the grand display of how wonderfully we are all dressed, aren't we beautiful, who is escorting whom, all of these new rituals of middle-class bourgeois life in Paris. This was the architecture that allowed all of that and celebrated that new existence that associated with the modern world. And here we see a student's depiction of that section continuing out onto the space of the street and down the boulevard itself. So the show doesn't stop when you leave the architecture out on the street. The architecture continues. The Grand Boulevard is a continuation of the space that is there to allow people to see each other and show off who they are. Places like Vienna at this moment were tearing down the defensive walls that had protected them from the Ottoman Empire for centuries and allowed them to develop a new portion of the city where those walls and fields of fire had stood. And it was done according to similar principles along the lines of what Haussmann was doing in Paris at around the same time. And the great ideas of Camillo Sitte, of the importance of the figurative formation of space, comes into being at this moment in Vienna. In the United States, you have the earlier configuration of the capital, the District of Columbia, according to the principles of axial vision and grand boulevards and diagonals that connect different important points. And you get a revival, a revisiting of that plan, and a boosting of the landscape, removal of the train tracks that interrupted it, to really make the capital city worthy of the nation that it led. And so we see these principles at play in the reconfiguration of the District of Columbia. And which brings us quickly to Chicago, 1893, and the World Columbian Exposition, celebrating the anniversary of Columbus, his discovery of the New World. Here in Chicago, aspiring to earn the right to claim the capital of the empire of the New World, as we talked about last week. Here, Daniel Burnham from the East Coast showed up in Chicago and proposed a grand white city for the theme of the Columbian Exposition, which, even though it was all made of temporary materials, paper-mache, chicken wire, wood studs, and was quickly demolished, it left a huge imprint on the psyche of the world. The continuation of the tradition from the Crystal Palace in 1850 in London, the wares and commodities and industrial innovations of the world were on display, but the hall itself stole the show and became the basis for a new city plan for Chicago, the 1909 Daniel Burnham City Chicago Plan, which had huge support and sponsorship by the wealthiest merchants and industrialists of Chicago, wanting to create an appropriate grandiosity to this new seat of empire located in the great Midwest of the continental United States. The Grant Park waterfront, all of that was built. Many of the other parts were not built. But here you see the principles imprinted on the landscape to extend the grandeur. And now we get into the interesting business of how to sell these ideas with compelling visual imagery. And once again, we have access to the larger system through these oblique views and the architectural space in the foreground. Very, very powerful way of depicting a new spatial social order appropriate to the city of Chicago. And so you see how it's not just after the fact, but an instrument of social transformation. And just in case it wasn't clear, one of the great sponsors, Wacker, sponsored a textbook that was used in schools, the public school system throughout Chicago, as a way of educating the youth of Chicago of civic duty and civic principles. And it was still at play in the classroom in Chicago up till the 1960s. And so a very powerful thing that went on to influence just about every other city in the United States at some point decided to build something worthy of these principles laid out by Daniel Burnham in the Chicago Plan of 1909, but came to be known by its larger movement, which took on the name the City Beautiful movement. And the idea was, by creating a beautiful portion of the city, that civic values would be instilled in the population, and there would be a moral, social call to civic duty of the populace. And this would become a very powerful instrument. Here we see Cleveland, Ohio, which was one of the more complete versions of this. San Francisco, with its City Hall complex, and really it went all over the world. The Philippines, Daniel Burnham visited there. The French, wherever they colonized, the French brought Haussmann's ideas. Northern Africa, Vietnam, Indochina, South America, wherever the French went, they imposed this on cities, and some of the greatest examples continue to be in the global South, the former colonial world. Here's an example. It was taught in art and architecture schools throughout the world, including Germany, where this student attempted to become an architect but failed a few courses. But he continued on. He became a very important person, helping to design the exposition, the German pavilion in the exposition in Paris of 1937. He helped to design the German automobile, the Volkswagen Bug, and he invented the highway system, the Autobahn. There's his sketch for the Bug, the national car of Germany. He designed the uniforms of the German military and the flag. And he became one of the most important, not just designers of the 20th century, but a very influential leader of the country of Germany, winning the presidency with a landslide election in the context of the oppressive deal made after World War I, pay war reparations, which really undermined their economic ability, But he continued to employ the power of design in everything he did. We are talking about Adolf Hitler. And he had a very strong role in the design of these stadia, these events. So it wasn't just the architecture, it was also the events and rituals that occurred within the architecture. These displays of grandeur that invoked the symbolism of ancient Rome. His job was to establish a story that Germany was destined to rule over the world and lead the Western civilization for 1,000 years. The Third Reich is what he called it. And part of the most important instruments of this project were not just the factories of death at Auschwitz and Birkenau, but also the architecture of triumph in Berlin. And this model, built with the assistance of Albert Speer, his architect, was in the bunker with Hitler when he was found dead at the end of World War II. It was a vision that was really one of the driving forces for the entire project. These spectacular ceremonies and events where not just using costume and bodies, but also the architecture of light, where these searchlights were pointed at the sky, evoking the classical triumph of these columns and the power, just to make it obvious that the Germans were destined to rule the world with a very powerful display.